Welcome to Living in Connection, where we explore the nature of physical and non-physical reality and what that means in your life.
Hello and welcome again. I'm Dirk Dunning and I'm here with Frank DeMarco. And we thought today we might talk about robots, if I remember correctly. What do you think, Frank?
It's an important topic, and the more you look at it, the larger it gets. I initially stole the idea from Colin Wilson, who used it in a very different way, though. He was talking about the habit systems that we have that sort of take over our life because we let them, because we're not paying attention. But it's sort of between the guys talking about it with me and a little bit of experience, the concept sort of migrated. I look at it now as this. Most of our life is regulated beyond our control, beneath the level of our consciousness. And if it's beneath the level of our consciousness, there's nothing we can do about it because what we see is what looks like it has to be. It's clear cut. There's no question about it. But the only reason there's no question about it is we have all of these unconscious decisions that were made for us before they ever got to the level of consciousness, which means we have no control over it. Carl Jung, and you've heard this, of course, many times, Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. And I take that to mean that if it's not conscious, you can't deal with it. You don't even know it exists. As soon as you know it exists, you can deal with it. And that's what I want to talk about mainly in the subject of robots, is how to deal with the robots and what they are. So let me give you a little disquisition and butt in when you want to, Dirk, because you and I have been in this conversation before. Here's the deal. We have all of these decisions that were made in the past, and we have these mechanisms in effect, at least that's the way I like to think of them, call them robots, that say, okay, Frank wants me to do this in this situation, so that's what I will do. And maybe when I was 15 years old, that is what I wanted in that situation. Or maybe it's something I never made a conscious decision about at all, but it was sort of followed from what I was and from what I did. Maybe the decisions that you made when you were 15 years old wouldn't look too good 50 years later if you happened to know that you had made those decisions. But as long as they're unconscious, they're invisible to us. I have found it very simple. Once you, and of course this is lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps, once you realize that something is happening beneath the level of consciousness, it is a very simple matter to call it into consciousness and negotiate with it and say, look, I'll give you a specific example. Many people would kind of like to believe in things beyond the physical world, but they find that they can't. They can't take it seriously. And then oftentimes, that's because they have a robot underneath there that is trying to protect them from becoming a flake. It thinks what it's doing is, I will keep my person safe from becoming ungrounded, from becoming, somebody chasing moonbeams. However, that doesn't really help us. What you can do, though, if you realize you have such a robot, call it into existence, personify it, if you would, call it into existence and say, look, I appreciate what you're doing. Here's what I'd rather you do instead. If you see something that you think might lead me in that direction, tell me, but don't make the decision. Bring it to my attention and let me use my consciousness to decide what I want to do with it. And then it doesn't matter. You may make exactly the same decision that the robot would have made, but now it's you making it and not the robot. And to the extent that we take over our own lives, it's a plus. Now, a little asterisk there. You have robots that do things like tie your shoes and help you shave in the morning and make your coffee for you. You don't want to be doing all those things consciously because it would take up all of our attention. But what you do want is to take control of anything that determines where you're going without you knowing it.
Yes.
Right? So that's enough of an intro, I think.
Well, one of the things I'm curious, we've talked a lot about robots and other things, is I think there are many layers to this. There are internal layers in the mind and perhaps higher self in other places where you have these automatic programs, if you will, running. The program's probably not a perfect term for it.
It's not a bad term.
But in doing energy work, I've also run into these where there are what are often colloquially called thought forms hanging out in the energy space of the person that can have similar kinds of effects. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, how broadly should we look at these in trying to understand robots and thought forms and all the related?
Well, my preferred method is usually to look at the effect and not try to figure out the cause in the sense of defining it, just as I talk about the guys upstairs without always trying to figure out whether it's George, Harry, Sam,
Sure.
or the ghost of the Count Saint Germain. In this case, whether it's a thought form, a robot, what I call an EXE file, which is really the same thing. It's a decision that was made before that continues to execute until you call it into consciousness and change the programming. All of those things. I don't see any advantage to defining it closely, although you may, and if you may, I'd be interested in hearing it. But I'm much more concerned with how do we find the things that are impinging on us and change them for our benefit?
Well, and I think this gets into the hows and the whys and where it comes from kind of thing, which is the place that I have a tendency to focus, which also gets related to the why, but the why kind of comes after, or in some cases before. Anyway, they're different parts. But the reason that I find it useful to know the distinction is if it's a thought form, if I'm doing energy work and I encounter it in somebody's energy body or my own, I can remove it and clean up the energy system and essentially remove that entire defect, or not even sure it's a defect, whatever it is, I can take it out of the system.
Yes.
And it has direct effects.
Yes.
If it's internal to the mind, that's different. That I can't directly influence that way doing energy work, but I can influence in other ways. So as an example, one of the focus states that the Monroe Institute found, that Bob Monroe found, was called Focus 11 or access channel. And it seems to be related to some ideas from John C. Lilly and others about how the mind works as it develops from infancy to adulthood, where there seem to be layers that close, where you're dealing with things in the world in particular ways, and you develop your own rule sets internally, and then a layer will close, and another set of things will be worked on, and a layer will close. And you get this stack that, in computer terms, it's like you've got a series of layers of programs, each dependent on what's before it.
Or another way of looking at it is it's a series of architectural additions. First, you learn to crawl, then you learn to kneel, then you learn to stand, then you learn to walk, then you learn to run. It isn't like one supplants the other, but is built upon it. I think that's good analogy.
Or like in building a building. First, you do the groundwork, then you build the foundation, then you build the bearing walls, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you've got a problem in one of those, that can create serious issues for anything that's dependent on it. And fixing that can be a different kind of problem to repair.
When you talked about thought forms, and you said you could work with them directly by getting rid of them, and you couldn't work as directly with things like robots. If that's true of other people, I imagine that's so. But for ourselves, it feels like it's the same. To me, it feels like it's the same thing. Whether it's a robot or an EXE file or a thought form, I don't know that I would know the difference. The only thing is I know to bring it into consciousness. But again, this is a good example of you coming from your point of view, the how does it work, and my coming from my point of view, which is the why does it work, and they always overlap, and they.
Well, and how it works in my case goes to what is available to us to reconfigure or do things in order to resolve whatever the issue is that's being caused by this.
Oddly enough, I could say the same thing.
Yeah. So where do we go from here?
Well, can you think of an example in your life? We'll probably, I'll let the guys, yours and mine, horn in on this. But can you think of an example in your life of a robot that you found and then got reprogrammed or got rid of, and it made a huge immediate difference?
Well, there's one in particular from work that I can relate to where one of my early bosses had an unfortunate way of managing. And as a consequence, I created an internal reaction in advance to his actions so that, the kind of things is if he called you to his office, it was a bad thing. So the immediate thing is a reaction that you're being called to the boss's office and you have this negative response that puts you in a bad place.
Right.
And it causes you not to be able to be as effective or to do the things you should do. And that continued after I left that job and went on to others where it was a completely different situation and different people that worked completely differently, but still that echo of a robot was there. Mm-hmm. And it took a while to recognize, okay, this is here, and how do I get rid of it? If you imagine a dog or something that it's got a foul-mannered owner who the first thing it does whenever it doesn't like something the dog does is hits it.
Yeah, I get the point. But how did you do it?
Mostly it had to do with recognizing what the issue was and going back and addressing that when it occurred in my mind to recognize that condition no longer exists.
All right. And that's a good point to mention. One of the reasons, the way I see it anyway, that robots or exe files get stuck, they do not recognize the passage of time.
Right.
Just as an emotion in a trauma doesn't recognize the passage of time, same with them. You made a decision 15 years ago that may have served you very well then, but now 15 years later, you're still having the same thing because they never got the word. Nobody ever passed them a memo that says this is not in effect anymore. So how did you pass them the memo? How did you do it? If you
literally, it had to do with partly it's meditation, but mostly it's thinking of realizing, and the problem is it's thinking and feeling. And these are very different things. One of the things, so aside, with many of my friends and talking through issues they have, I see them run into the problem where they will try to think their way through a feeling or to feel their way through a logical thought. Neither of those work. You have to
it's hard for me to imagine. Well, we don't need to imagine it, but it's just hard for me to imagine how you would do that. But yes, you have to. It's the same thing, really, from different angles.
Right. But what that meant was that in my case, there was both the thought part and the feeling part of, like the dog getting struck, that as soon as the word happens, it's invoking a feeling. And the response to stopping that hadn't to do with thinking about it and recognizing verbally kinds of things, how to respond to it. It was in feeling through the situation and feeling it no longer existing.
Did you have to do that only once, or did you have to do it repeatedly?
The first time removed most of it. It required several more times because there were still echoes of it left around.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Yes. All right. Now, putting ourselves in the mind of who's ever watching this, have we told them everything they need to do to deal with their own robots? I think we have, but what do you think?
Well, I think there's more. And it goes like this, that if John Lilly is right, and he did huge amounts of research, incredible stuff, he tried to save all of that for humanity in a book that he wrote, but he wrote it at a very high grade level because it's dangerous knowledge. You can misapply it. And you can also hurt yourself if you're not careful. But what he pointed out was that because these layers close in your mind at certain ages, if the issue you're trying to deal with occurred earlier in life inside of a closed layer, trying to change that is much more difficult. And so you get things like psychologists who will go through talk therapy and things that take a long time to resolve an issue like this for someone. But in essence, what they end up doing is creating a whole new program at another layer to anticipate and react to the program below without actually changing it. And so if you can find ways to actually change the initial insult in the response to it, Now you actually resolve the problem rather than creating a bigger problem.
Well, that's right. Everything you described there sounds way more complicated than the problem itself.
Right.
I'm wondering if what I'm saying is simplistic, because this is my experience of it is become aware of it, talk to it as if you were talking to a reasonable person, and say, I thank you for what you're trying to do for me. I know you're on my side, but this is not working. I want you to do this instead of that. And another half of it, I think we discussed this in one of our recordings, the time that I personified my left brain, and because it was getting in the way of trying to get new experiences. And I said, you work the camera, you work the tape recorder, and we'll talk about it later. I'm going to depend upon you to do that, but don't get in the way of the experience. It was perfectly happy to do that. It gave it a job. It gave it a job that was compatible with its nature. Well, if let's make up a thought experiment here. Let's say when I was 10 years old, I was frightened by a dog, maybe bitten by a dog, who knows, that doesn't matter. But whatever happened caused a trauma, caused an emotional reaction that was automatically there, so that I would have the fight, flight, or freeze syndrome whenever I heard a dog bark, say, or saw a dog that looked threatening. Now, you can't talk your way out of that, I don't believe. And moving your feelings around without a conceptual framework, I think that's too slippery. But I think it would be as simple as, well, we did this at an exercise at Monroe one time, actually. You send yourself back to that time, and you could either envision how it could have changed, I suppose, or you could envision this is what it was, but we're not going to take this as an indicator of how we're going to respond in the future. Yes, we were scared today, but that doesn't mean we're going to be scared tomorrow, because most dogs are friendly, or that kind of thing. See a flaw in that, or would that work?
No, but let me go another step with that. And I'll use a specific example without involving anyone's name or what the events were. But I had a very dear friend that she, as a child, her father was a drunk, and he would beat upon her and also beat up on her little brother. And she was suffering severely, that she felt very guilty that she hadn't adequately protected her little brother.
Yeah.
And so the mechanism that we went through was, and it involved many, many layers. It's not just one. But the first layer was getting her to go back to that time safely, recognizing it's past. She's now revisiting it as an adult, seeing herself as a child. And it turns out she was only 3 years old. Now, she's 3 years old. She sees herself there, and she can talk with herself or commune with herself. And it was about recognizing in the scene that, this isn't a grown adult man that's beating up her little brother.
Nothing she could have done.
There is nothing she could have done. There is no reason for guilt. She did everything she could have done and more. Everything from her perspective she did was right. There's no reason to hold guilt, and no reason to hold fear of this happening again. That situation is done and gone. Later cycles through involve more things about, and this was more difficult, of going to his situation, to the father's situation, to understand his life and what he was going through. And the point wasn't about him, really. It was about getting to forgiveness and releasing that from her end and her connection to it.
To go back to your first part, though, how, if you can describe it, because I know these things are not really word-oriented, but how did you get her to not only experience again being 3 years old, but to get the realization? Oh, no, I suppose experiencing it would make the realization automatic to a grown-up. It changed her perspective.
Right, and it involved basically a modified trance state. This isn't hypnosis, this isn't even the Monroe kind of things, but it involves something akin to those, in a safe space where she felt safe with me, felt safe with everything else. She knows there's no danger here. And then talking through being apart from the emotions of that time, but being able to see them and know what's happening without, again, experiencing them, disconnecting that. And then going back and watching the situation unfold and seeing the events in truth and recognizing her as an adult and her as a child and the differences.
Sure.
And then loving herself as a child.
Would you say it was important or even possible to have her go through the logical consequences, how this thing created habit patterns that are still affecting her life? Or is that not necessary?
It's not absolutely necessary. In her case, she wanted to know. And so after going through many cycles of getting this result, we then did not, I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on TV or any of that sort of thing. This isn't a clinical kind of thing, and it's not a hard science kind of thing either. But I did, in general terms, talk her through how this may be working. That gave her a framework to hang on to it, to know. And the point of that was not to do it again or anything else. It was about knowing that what we've done is permanent. This isn't going to now revert or change or do anything else.
Now, that would be, I would think, the hardest point to get across, because that's an act of faith. That's right. She's having to believe you rather than having yet had the experience. This all being true, supposing you're somebody who has a problem and you have no one to help you with it. Is there anything in what we said that someone can't do by themselves?
They can do it by themselves. I think I would suggest, this is a guess, I would suggest that one of the keys is the part that I was describing about when you're going to do this, of being in a safe space, number one, knowing that you've got all the time in the world, everything around you is safe, you're in a safe environment, and that you're going to, knowing that you're going to go back and you're going to revisit this very painful situation. And in doing that, you're going to choose to not feel those feelings again. You're going to see them and witness them, but you're not going to echo it. You're not going to re-feel them again.
That's what Bob Monroe used to say. Remember the experience, but leave the emotions behind.
Exactly.
We have to say that more than 30 times.
Yeah. And it's the same thing.
I would say I'm always concerned with these things that we make it sound, inadvertently, make it sound harder than it actually is. It's not, well, you said, and rightly so, getting in a safe space and having enough time. However, in my experience, when I'm ready for it, some realization will surface. And then it becomes mostly a matter of being willing to stay with it, because it's usually something you don't want to remember. Otherwise you wouldn't have repressed it all this time. But if you're willing to stay with it and you're willing to assume, I would say, that this is coming up at this time for a reason, and it's coming up at this time because I'm able to deal with it now, I think that would be a very tenable place to stand.
And as an aside, I want to repeat that we are not professionals in this field. We don't do psychology or any of that sort of thing. That for people who may be watching, if they have psychotherapists or others that they rely on and medical professionals, use them. Perhaps use these tools, perhaps use their tools. That's up to you. But don't just take what we're saying for face value without, sanity checking it with professionals.
No, I can't agree with that, actually.
Okay.
What you're saying makes a lot of sense, and of course it's legally protective, but it would be like asking a professional, is telepathy possible? Yeah. Well, that professional may think he knows, but if he doesn't know, he's going to give you very confident instructions that are the opposite of the truth. Who's going to be closer to the truth than yourself if you're open to it?
I agree with that. At the same time, we live in the world we live in, so that we have to give the cautions that we have to give. But in terms of doing things, everybody's sovereign in themselves to do the things they need to. You and I both have been through medical situations where the doctors are doing the absolute best that they know how, but they don't know you in a really detailed way. And you know best for you.
That's right. Well, if it were a polarity, they're more on the medical end, we're more on the experiential end. And
Yeah.
we probably meet somewhere in the middle, but you need both.
Yeah.
But I've spent most of my life avoiding medical advice, and that was probably not the smartest thing I ever did. So,
Well, and I learned this morning, I've been through some medical things of my own recently, and it turned out in doing some of the standard approaches, I created the very problem I was trying to avoid. Because my physiology, my biology is so different than the norm that the standard approaches produce paradoxically exactly the wrong answers.
wasn't that sort of what I was getting at
Yeah.
with the, okay. It always comes down to you're going to have to trust your own judgment. It's
Mhm.
best to get a check on that judgment if you can. But if you can't, if you're on good terms with your unconscious, it will not steer you wrong. At least it never has in my experience.
So let's go back to robots, because that's always fun.
Have we left them?
You can also use robots intentionally.
We always do.
And, we should probably talk about that a little bit before we depart here.
Okay. How much time do we have? Where are we now?
Well, we just got a couple of minutes, but we can at least broach the subject. And maybe what we'll do, how about we do this? Let's end it here. And then let's come back and do another session talking about how to use robots proactively.
Okay. Works for me.
All right. Well, thank you all, and we'll see you again very shortly.
If you enjoyed this episode, please press like. Please press subscribe to stay informed of new episodes as they appear. We would love to hear from you in the comments section below, and we wish you the very best in connecting with your own guidance.